Howdy y'all, welcome back. Thank you for being here. Today, I wanted to share with you a few more of my experiences in the wilderness exploring throughout Maryland and Pennsylvania over the last few months, and will include a few of the discoveries I've made in my research into these locations. Now, I've been trying to spend as much of my free time exploring the reaches of the great rivers, the trails, and the ancient paths which were once within the domain of the Susquehannock Indigenous People. In doing so, I've made some rather profound discoveries and realizations. One, we're told when the Susquehannock were first found by the European settlers in the Chesapeake Bay, it doesn't exactly make for a smooth transition. For starters, the Susquehannock, also later known as the Conestoga, are described in this narrative as a robust and unique people, not just in their customs and traditions, which would later become adopted by the Europeans, but also in their size. The first people to make contact with the Susquehannock are theorized to be the French, due to the Susquehannock possessing brass weaponry and other advanced, seemingly French European ornaments. Yet this was only deduced by John Smith, an Englishman, in roughly 1608, who had the first recorded contact with the Susquehannock. It seems a bit fishy that the French would not make note of conducting trade with a never-before-seen group of indigenous people who ruled over a massive kingdom along the span of a great river which stretched across what are today the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. That 1 mile wide and 444 mile long river is known as the Susquehanna and is the longest river in the United States without commercial watercraft. The Susquehanna River was also home to a series of what became the longest bridges in the entire world when they were completed in the early 1800s, colloquially known as the Columbia-Wrightsville Bridge. It's worth noting that the piece of land which contained the largest Susquehannock fortress was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and became known as Columbia. Now, I've waxed poetic about the importance of the Susquehannock to the very basis of early American society, with many key aspects of the culture which shaped fledgling America being adopted or inherited from the Susquehannock. These Conestoga introduced the Europeans to tobacco cultivation through the Conestoga, also known as the stogie, which became the original name for the cigar. The Conestoga Susquehannock also amalgamated with the European settlers within their final fortress, the Conestoga town in Lancaster, producing such inventions as the Conestoga wagon or the covered wagon and the Conestoga or Lancaster repeating rifle. To be clear, today, we are told that a majority of the initial reports regarding the Susquehannock were greatly exaggerated, and most of their inventions are now credited to European settlers. This becomes even more murky when you realize that a bulk of the patents that may have been attributed to indigenous people, indigenous inventors in early America were destroyed in the Great Fire of the American Patent Office in 1836, with any remaining inconsistencies seemingly being covered over in an additional Patent Office fire in 1877. Now, according to John Smith in 1608, who was knighted in Transylvania following his service in the Chesapeake Bay, which is the estuary of the Susquehanna River, Smith describes the Susquehannock as extremely large, as having both olive and pale skin, with most showing oddly European features like auburn, brown, or red hair, and light-colored eyes. However, the height of the Susquehannock is what confounds modern historians, as Smith writes that a majority of them stood well over 6 feet tall, with many over 7 feet tall. Later accounts of the Susquehannock seem to confirm, at least partially, Smith's claims, which further describe the Susquehannock living in fortified and palisaded towns constructed on top of earthworks and other earthen fortifications, with the fortress that Smith visited said to possess at least one cannon, which at the time of writing his account absolutely blew Smith's mind. He could only deduce that the brass and European-style weaponry and other artifacts must have been French in origin. but even that aspect of the narrative is very much up for debate today. What proceeded from roughly 1608 through 1763 was about 155 years of the Susquehannock reshaping history. For all intents and purposes, everything west of the Susquehanna River at this time period was considered indigenous land, with the Susquehannock seemingly being the liaisons from the other indigenous groups to the European settlers. The Susquehannock, known for their earthworks, are also known to have helped develop, settle, or simply clear the way for European settlers, although it seems more likely that the Susquehannock introduced the European settlers to a vast system of trails, pathways, and forts that were already established by the Susquehannock in the general vicinity. When the Susquehannock were still a popular aspect of American culture, which, for reference, they were, as depicted on many of the earliest American pieces of artwork, we often see what are described as indigenous people. Today, we're mostly told these are general depictions of the Iroquois, but what they don't tell you is that often these depictions are mostly of the Susquehannock and Iroquois-speaking people who had their own distinct language and only became known as Iroquois-speaking when the Iroquois and the Susquehannock buried the hatchet at the King and Queen seat in what is today Jarrettsville, Maryland. Myths, legends, and even major historians of the 18th and 19th centuries believe that these rock formations in Maryland served as a meeting place for the Susquehannock for centuries, where their supreme chief, or Great Khan, would climb to the top of the Great Rock to deliver sermons and speeches. It was also at this location that the Great Khan's son, the Prince of the Susquehannock, was married to the Great Chief of the Iroquois' daughter, the Princess, thus uniting the two great tribes. While this is absolutely believable, the amalgamating of the Iroquois and the Susquehannock history, as well as the Susquehannock being extinct by the end of the 18th century, has done little to clarify the true nature of what we see in front of us, what the history really is. The King and Queen seat sit within Rock State Park, again, subtly named specifically for the King and Queen seat, which became a prominent destination for explorers even decades before this became a well-known state park. This is worth researching, just how many historians actually looked into Susquehannock history in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's as if historians at that time believed there was a lost history, or a lost people that were waiting to be rediscovered, but I digress. Now, the research on the Susquehannock seems to have all but stopped in the early to mid-1900s when a series of court rulings in Pennsylvania determined that for centuries the Susquehannock were extinct, since exactly 1763. Still, within the region of Rock State Park, we also have Kilgore Falls, said to be the second tallest waterfall in all of Maryland, and a key piece within the trails of Maryland, which was once home to the Susquehannock Summer Retreat. Kilgore Falls is absolutely beautiful. It's stunning, it's truly picturesque, and the waterfall is quite literally so gorgeous you can walk underneath it. I've never been to something like this before on the East Coast. However, what really stood out to me about this location within the name and the landscape is that Kilgore Falls is on a secluded, unpaved road known as Falling Branch Road in a section of Rock State Park known as the Falling Branch. Not only is the road unpaved and secluded, but there's also intense signage up and down the road on both sides claiming absolutely zero parking at any time, and the road appears to be monitored. Adding to this bizarre scene, we're also told that Falling Branch section of this park is often off limits to public visitors, including on every weekend, every holiday, and for a large portion of the year, unless you have a permit. Obviously, in my research, seeing this level of protection of an area sets off a few alarms in my head, and when you see what I saw, you may understand why. Now, I do not claim to be an expert, and I certainly don't claim to know exactly what the ancient indigenous paths were built from and when, or how they appear to interweave so many different trails throughout the forest. But when we look at the waterways in Maryland, What we do know is that we have a very clear man-made rock structure. We have rock formations throughout Rock State Park, and in some locations, these formations have quite literally grown so old, so weathered, that it's hard to tell when the man-made portion or the Susquehannock created, the indigenous created portion of these trails begins and where the naturally occurring rock ends. Situated high on this steep outcropping that's overlooking Kilgore Falls directly is a rather unique rock formation. It's about 50 feet off the beaten path and rather difficult to see behind a bunch of trees and shrubbery, but I came across this rock formation and I had to do a double and then a triple take. Again, this is all considered to be naturally occurring rock with really no mention within these paths or these trails about who built all of this and when and if any of this stonework is considered to be man-made, yet we see the evidence that it is. Now, at the apex of this hillside overlooking Kilgore Falls, which was cut by the very water that flows to create the falls, we see an obtuse rock which juts out from the landscape like an ancient and petrified tree stump. Why do I say that? Because to me, it looks exactly like an ancient and petrified tree stump. Furthermore, if we're truly going to entertain that theory, which I'd like to do for just a moment, isn't it odd that this protected portion of the Rock State Park, mostly off limits to the public, is called Fallen Branch? If you're like me and you've researched a lot of history, you'll know a common theme, especially in America, we see tongue-in-cheek references, symbolism, within the names of many locations. I'll include some detailed video I took of this rock formation after carefully climbing off the path, but again, this is just my opinion here, but I can't help but see this rock and it resembles all of the tree stumps around it that we can find throughout the forest, except this formation is about 30 times as big as those other tree stumps. Maybe this formation, I didn't get an exact measurement obviously, but we're looking at maybe 30 feet tall, at least 60 feet wide, if not wider. And could this be the source of the Fallen Branch name for this section of the park? To wrap up the video, I want to share how small the world feels sometimes, or at least how every single thread appears to be connected if you dig deep enough. The King and Queen seat in Maryland, as I mentioned, was pretty infamous for the 18th and 19th centuries before being all but forgotten and then rediscovered or revitalized in the mid-20th century. Now, that being said, it was really only modern historians and those, quote, in the know, who unrelentingly sought to protect this landscape, which led to the creation of Rock State Park. However, how much of the theories regarding the Susquehannock are known in, let's say, high society? Well, in the year 2002, the King and Queen seat were chosen, as well as the Rock State Park and the surrounding towns and cities, to be the filming location for a Hollywood movie, a movie that I actually watched a bunch of times as a child, Tuck Everlasting. And this was the only movie that was ever filmed at the King and Queen seat. Again, this might only be relevant to me, but I still had a good shock when I read this bit of coincidence. If you've been with my channel since the beginning or since I started uploading about 5 years ago, you'll know I'm a pretty die-hard fan of the TV show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Well, would you believe it? The Always Sunny in Philadelphia creators only met at the audition for the movie of Tuck Everlasting. This movie itself only cast in this area on the East Coast because of the Susquehannock King and Queen seat and the surrounding region fit the bill for the movie location. Meaning, without this ancient Susquehannock site, we wouldn't have the TV show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And that's just my little Easter egg for this video. But realistically, without the Susquehannock, it appears a whole lot of our history in America, the early history, would be different. And that could go as deep as just about every aspect of early American history being slowly shifted to uninstall the Susquehannock as a pillar or foundation of our culture. Truly, the intensity in which the Susquehannock history was scrubbed in the early 20th century alongside other factors I haven't even mentioned today, like the Susquehannock being theorized to be descendants of the mound builders, and following the Susquehannock being wiped out in 1763, we have a rapid influx of Europeans opening just about every mound in America, which culminated in the giant craze of the 19th century, where hundreds of articles were published in places like the New York Times, claiming that 7-foot-tall skeletons belonging to the mound builders had been discovered throughout America. Who else is described as over 7 feet tall in numerous historical narratives? The indigenous Susquehannock, that are theorized to be related to the mound builders, the same Susquehannock who were wiped out in 1763 in Lancaster, which was followed by the founding of the United States and the rapid destruction of indigenous mounds, earthworks, and history. Many would simply call that a coincidence, but in my line of study, we don't believe in those. But I would love to hear your thoughts, theories, and opinions in the comment section down below, and we will talk about this more on the next video.